Well, I know many of us are thinking, well, Thanksgiving's in the rearview mirror, and we need to charge forward to the next holiday. And that is true. We do need to do that. And we have some weeks ahead that we will be looking at a series related to the Christmas season. But I always think it's interesting that when we get to the Thanksgiving season, and given the fact that I didn't get to be here last Sunday, I want to make sure we take time to talk about thankfulness and thanksgiving. You know, I'm going to share with you a lot of little anecdotes from our trip to Mexico. Much of our time we spent was with a national pastor there. He is now the pastor of it was the first church that Tim Hendricks and his wife started there in Aguascalientes. And his name is Pastor Edgar, and he and his family now pastor this church. And we spent several different days with him, and he had a limited amount of English, but we were able to communicate with him all right. And one of the questions in the different days that we asked, we talked about different things in ministry. He asked me, he said, "What is your most important holiday?" And I said, well, he said, "Was it Christmas or Thanksgiving?" Of course, they don't have Thanksgiving in Mexico. Pilgrims didn't land down there. But they don't have that as a holiday. He says, "Or is it Easter?" He said, "Maybe Easter, or maybe it was some other holiday." And I began to talk to him a little bit about it. And, I said, well, of course, Easter's really an important holiday because it's the resurrection. We celebrate the fact that Christ arose. That's where our hope is. And that's a really important holiday for us to celebrate. And I said, and there are many that, of course, in our culture that would say Christmas is our number one holiday. I said Christmas, of course, it probably gets the biggest commercialized hype of any holiday in our country. And for the Christians, it's important to remember and reflect upon the birth of Christ. That's an important thing to do. I said, but for me, I think the most important holiday for Christians, even though it's not always celebrated as such, is Thanksgiving. And I think the reason for that is you see in Scripture time and time again that we are called to give thanks. We are to give praise to God without ceasing. In all things give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus, right? This is written in Scripture, in the fabric of who we are as Christians. We are supposed to have a spirit of thankfulness. And it's not just supposed to be on one day of the year. It's not just supposed to be when we get the turkey and the stuffing and the pumpkin pie. It's not just supposed to be on, this little precursor to the big holiday before Christmas. It's supposed to be something that exudes from our life in how we act, in how we react, in how we treat others, in how we express who we are between our relationship with God. It's supposed to be based in thankfulness. Isn't our salvation itself based in a spirit of thankfulness? We do nothing to deserve salvation. We did nothing to earn salvation. Christ did it all for us. And when we turn back to the favorite verse that every young kid learns in Sunday school, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Just that verse alone should give us a whole life in which we have nothing to express but thankfulness. And so this was my heart, and I tried to express this to him, and I don't think he quite understood exactly what I was saying. Sometimes some things get lost in translation between the English and the Spanish, but nonetheless, it made me think about the fact that, oftentimes, many of you probably sat around the table here on Thursday, or maybe whatever day you had some Thanksgiving time with family or friends. And you may have reminded yourselves of some things you were thankful for. So you may have gone around and said, well, I'm thankful for the people that are here around me in my life. Or you may have said, I'm thankful for the fact that we have food on our table. We have all these good things that people brought. Or you may be thankful for a warm house that you get to live in. Or you may be thankful for the free country that we have. Or you may be thankful for any number of things that God has blessed you with in your life. And it's not wrong to do that. In fact, it's very good to remember that every good and every perfect gift comes from the Father above, with whom there is no variableness nor shadow of turning. Everything that we have that's good, we can thank God for. Even if maybe somebody, Aunt Edna brought the pumpkin pie, it's still God that's provided that pie, right? It's still God that gives you every good and every perfect gift. The truth is, when we think about thankfulness, we're kind of primed for it this time of year. And when we gather around the Thanksgiving turkey, we tend to think about those things because we're already geared up for it. But I can tell you, just from experience, and this is no different from me, from any one of you, if you go on a Wednesday night, oftentimes I will ask, before we ask for prayer requests, who has something to thank the Lord for this week? And you know what I hear a lot of the time? Not all the time. I hear crickets. Everybody's silent. Nobody has something to say. They're not primed. They came primed to share all my burdens, all of my troubles. Here's what we need to pray for. And we do need to bring our requests to God. But we should be primed all the time with something to give thanks for. And I think the reason we have a problem with that in American society is because the basis of Thanksgiving for us are all of the things, right? And again, they're not wrong, but the basis of it is often, I'm thankful for the new car, I'm thankful for the job, I'm thankful for the money, I'm thankful for whatever it is, relationships that I've got in my life. For Paul, getting here to Philippians, he recognized that the basis of thanksgiving, the basis of his thankfulness, was not in the things that he had. The basis for his thankfulness was in his contentment that he found in his relationship with the Lord. And so I want us to just share 4 thoughts this morning about how contentment, understanding a biblical understanding of contentment, can bring us a heart of thanksgiving that we can carry with us throughout the year. Let's look at, first of all, of course, we're kind of jumping into the middle of this passage. Paul's writing to the church at Philippi, dealing with a number of particular issues, but really it's a book of encouragement to him. And as he brings together it all to a close here at the end of chapter 4, in verse 8 he says, finally, brethren, he says, let me sum this up. Whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Of course, he's leading into how he gets contentment. And the first thing he shares with them is contentment. If you're going to have it, it's going to start with your mind. Contentment is going to start with the things that you are thinking about. And we often believe falsely in our society today that our contentment will be based upon our needs being provided for. Our contentment will be something that is bestowed upon us when all of our needs are somehow met, when we have enough stuff, when all of our relationship problems have been sorted out and I'm at peace with everybody around me. By the way, that's probably never going to happen. We're all human beings. Relationships are never going to always be perfect. We believe that we will have contentment when we get that promotion, or when we get a little bit more status, or maybe when we just get a little bit more position in our life, at work or in society. And Paul says, no, he says, brethren, if you want the source of contentment, it's going to start in your mind. It's going to start with what you are dwelling upon. He says to think on these things. Contentment is vital to our mental well-being. You know, holidays are oftentimes the most stressful and discouraging and depressing things for some people for various reasons. We all have our own backgrounds. We all have our own baggage. We all have our own things going on in our life. And oftentimes mental well-being goes on a steep decline when the holidays hit. And do you know what Paul says? There's a solution to this. It's called dwelling on the things that God has given you in your mind. And he gives you this list. You can tell what is in your mind by what it is you're talking about, by what it is that you are doing and how you are acting. Have you ever met someone who's like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, right? There's always this dark rain cloud that follows them wherever they go. There's someone that you say, I'm not sure I want to ask, how's your day going? Because they might tell you. You don't want them to know, hey, here's what's going on, because you just want them to go and leave you alone, right? For them, everything is wrong all of the time. For them, there's always another complaint that they've got on the list, right? For them, they're always sharing something with you that really is going to draw you into their misery. Because why? Their mind is fixated on all of the bad in the world, right? But Paul says we need to fix our minds on things that God has given us, the good things that will bring us to a state of contentment in our minds first. We need a state of mental well-being. And so he gives us this list. He says, here's what you need to think about. Think about those things that are true. Do you know, as believers, we are the only group of people in the world that have the truth? Have you thought about that? People all around say they have truth, but do you realize the truth is only found in God's Word? This is the only source of truth that we have. We can dwell on truth anytime, anywhere. We can meditate upon it. And do you know what? That's going to improve our state of contentment. We can look around and see all the untruths that the world around us might be telling us, or that they might believe, or that they might think are true, and we can come back and say, hey, I don't need to be discouraged by that. I don't need to be distressed by that. Instead, what do I need to do? I need to dwell on the truth that I know. I need to think about the truth that God's given me, because that's what's going to feed my soul and bring me contentment. He says, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest. You ever filled a room full of people? You're going to find a room full of people who don't always tell you the truth. You're going to find a room full of people that aren't always going to be honest around you. There's going to be deception. There's going to be a lot of dishonesty around you. People that will cheat you. Honesty is a hard thing to come by anymore. We need to dwell on those things that are honest. Dwell on those things that are just. There's a lot of injustice in this world. We have to dwell on those things that are still just. And do you know who is the perfect and just one? That's God Himself. He is the model of justice. And even when we see injustice all around us, when we see bad people getting away with all kinds of things, do you know what we need to have as our resource? It's the determination that God doesn't change, and God is holy and just, and one day He will set at straight everything that's gone wrong in the world around us. We have that hope. We have that assurance that God will not let injustice go on forever, that injustice will be dealt with. God is our refuge for justness. He says, think on those things that are pure. Everything, even the good things, all seem to have bad things with them, right? I always from the time I was a kid, have used Ivory soap. Okay? I don't know why. It's just one of those things, It floats. It's the only soap that floats, right? And why? Because it's pure, right? Well, not quite. I guess probably at some point they got in trouble by saying it's 100% pure. And so what is Ivory soap? It's 99 and 44/100% pure. Now that's the advertisement now from Ivory soap. That's why it floats, because it's almost pure. But even Ivory soap isn't 100%. It's hard to find things that are completely, totally pure. But there are still pure and good things that we should be dwelling upon, things that are given to us from God. He says, dwell on those things. Dwell on the things that are lovely. What do we look upon that is lovely in our life? We see a lot of things that are really sad, really difficult to see. I went down to Mexico, and some people ask, well, what kind of a country is it? I would say that many of us understand what a third world country is, and I don't think you would call Mexico a third world country. I think you'd call it more of a second world country. They have many of the modern conveniences that we have. In fact, I probably saw more American restaurants down there than I can have within driving distance of my house. They had things like Applebee's and Chili's and Dairy Queen and I don't know what all else, McDonald's and Burger King and all the rest. But do you know what? When you drive down the road, you'll find that, number one, there are very few lines on the road to know what lane you're in or how many lanes there should be in the first place. And I guess it wouldn't matter anyway because everybody just kind of picks a part of the road or part of being off the road. The pavement is not by any chance. It looked like it was paved in 1952 and never got changed since then. You think the potholes are bad here in Pennsylvania? Go to Mexico and drive for a little bit, and you'll find out what a pothole is all about. And there's you look at a lot of the houses, even a lot of the churches. You'll see some pictures tonight. I took a picture of the outside of the church we were at last Sunday. It looks like a picture right out of the ghetto in New York City. Metal bars on the doors, the whole thing's in disrepair. The extent of their church sign is a banner that they had printed that they stuck up above. And to get into the main door of the church, there is like a steel garage door with a little man door that opens in it. And that's the main entrance to the church. No fancy windows, no fancy glass, paint peeling from the sides. And you know, when you walk into that place, you think, what kind of drug deal am I getting into here? But when you walk in, you saw the smile and the rejoicing and the worship of fellow believers, even in the midst of a very difficult place. You know, there wasn't really anything lovely about the place. But when you get and realize that you are with other believers from another part of the world who don't even speak your language but share a common faith with you, you realize this is something lovely. I'm not in a lovely place, but I am at the same time. That's what's amazing about the fellowship we have with other believers. And there are things that are still lovely in our lives. So he says, dwell on these things. Dwell on those things that are of good report. Things that not all the bad news. Think about some of the good news. Think about if there's any virtue, if there's anything to praise the Lord for. This is what we are to fill our minds with. The more we dwell on everything that's wrong in our life, the less we will have room to dwell on the things that God has blessed us with. The first pastor, Pastor Edgar was his name. As I said, we spent much of the week with him. You go to his church, and as is most of Mexico, there's very few things made out of wood, and everything has to be fenced in or secured in some way because there are thieves. And so if you go to his church, about half of it is a brick wall, and on top of that brick wall is a barbed wire fence. The rest of it's made with fencing and then razor wire across the top. And it's like a compound that you walk into when you go into this church. And you say, boy, with all the brickwork down there, you know, most of you know I'm not much of a bricklayer. In fact, I've never laid a brick in my life. But that wouldn't stop me from laying bricks, right? I would still, somebody said, do we have some bricks to lay? I would go lay some bricks. But the church looked like I built it. You can imagine how I would be as a novice bricklayer building a church. There was nothing finessed about any of the brickwork there. It was straight, but I mean beyond that, I'm not sure much else you could say about the brickwork of the church. And you know what? It's just not a very big building. In fact, the whole church building is not as big as our whole auditorium here. And the pastor didn't have a place to live, and so after they apparently built this poor quality brickwork basement, bottom of the church, the pastor decided he would build another area on top of the church where he would live. And so he and his family with 3 kids live in an area that's smaller than this. on a second floor in a piece of brickwork building on top of the church. And of course, he's looking for more space. He's already outgrown the space, and he knows that. But you know what? There was never a sense from him or from any of the people that they were going without. There was never a sense from any of them that this is not good enough. There was never a sense that God had not been blessing them. There was never a sense that, oh, we need more money, we need more this, we need more of that. There was never that. If you talk to the pastor, he was proud of what he had. He was thankful for the fact that God had provided. He was thankful for the house that he had been given. And you know what? All the conditions that he was living in, they didn't affect the understanding that what he had was a gift from God. And he didn't look at it as a negative thing. He was thankful because contentment had started in the mind. And so we got to move on from this, but just some thoughts. We all at times struggle with discontentment. And when we do, I think the first thing we need to begin to remember is this, is to stop looking around at what we don't have and start dwelling on the things that we do have in our minds. Allow contentment to start in the mind. Verse 9, let's continue. He says, those things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me do, and the God of peace shall be with you. This is Paul talking to the folks at Philippi, and he says, contentment, he says, if you can't put it in your mind, he says, I want you to realize that contentment is something that can be modeled. It's something that I have been modeling for you. I've been trying to demonstrate to you what it is to be content. And you know, sometimes it's not enough for us to just say, well, think on the good things, think positive thoughts, try to get through it and keep yourself up by the bootstraps. Paul says, no, he says, that's where you need to be. He says, but sometimes you need to see that in someone else. He said, so look to me. He says, so those things that I've modeled for you, he says, you need to look at in me. Sometimes we need to see that model of contentment in other people. Sometimes we can get so wrapped up in ourselves, so wrapped up in our needs and our wants or our inabilities that we miss the model of contentment that can be found in other people. And so he says, look at these things. He says, you've learned things from me. He says, those things which you have both learned, those things you've received from me, those things you've heard, things that I've said to you, and things that you've just seen, observed in me. He says, those are the things that you need to take on in your life. You need to allow those modeled behaviors to be things that you absorb and you put into your own life as well. And he says, the result of this is that the God of peace shall be with you. Now, we know that God never leaves us or forsakes us as believers. But do you know what? Sometimes the peace of God does. Sometimes even as believers, we have distress. Sometimes even as believers, we have times where we just don't have peace, right? And so he says, you begin to put these models into your life. He says, you're going to find that God, that inner peace that you want from God, you're going to get. That inner peace that's going to bring contentment. You see, a model is only good if you begin to practice or to do the things that they are doing, right? I can sit all day and watch somebody, go deer hunting. Of course, it's deer hunting season, right? And I can watch deer hunting videos all day long about how they scope out where they're going and what gun they use and how they, whatever, all the different techniques and tactics. But do you know what? If I don't go out in the woods and start trying to put those things into practice, I'm not much of a deer hunter, right? That's true for a Christian life too. Sometimes we sit around and say, oh yeah, I admire this person. That person really has some contentment. Boy, this person's always got joy in their life, and I'm just going to get around them every now, so maybe some will rub off on me. But do you know what? God's put models in our lives so that we might begin to mimic, that we might begin to use them as a model so that we can begin to put that into our lives as well. If you see someone who's always full of joy, you need to find out how do they get to that point. You need to say, what practices can I put in my life? If that's the kind of person that God's put in me as a model, do you know what? That means we are to be followers of that. Find out what it is that makes them the way they are. Figure out how I can make some changes in my life to get the misery out and to put in that joy. Because they've obviously figured out something that you haven't. Let them be a model or a mentor to you. You observe the model, then you work to put those things into practice in your own life. So, again, when you're struggling to be content, try to find a model. Try to find that one who demonstrates contentment. Find out how they maintain that contentment despite the circumstances that they have faced. One of the things that we went on a hike one day with the pastor and his family, and the beds in Mexico aren't the most, they're not posturepedic, put it that way. In fact, many of them weren't much better than, I don't know, probably the pew seats were softer than the beds for some of us. Maybe it was just my bed, I don't know. And I, you know, that's part of what you do when you go to another country. You learn to deal with those things. You learn to deal with the cold showers and some of the other things that inconvenience you. But, you know, I thought it was very interesting. And like I said, I already told you how the pastor and his family lived in this little cramped quarters up above the church building in this poorly designed brick structure. But we were out hiking one day. And he said, you know, my family and I, we really love to go camping. I said, really? I thought that's what you were doing every day. And I said, like, in a tent? He says, yes, in a tent. He didn't know the word for tent. And so he liked it. I said, so we were like hiking through whatever area, and he was talking about how they go camping. I said, so do you like have a mat or a sleeping bag or something? Like, how do you go camping? He says, oh yeah, we have a sleeping bag. I'm thinking, it's 80 degrees out here. I can't imagine sleeping in a sleeping bag, but this is what they do. He says, we like to go tenting and go camping and rough it a little bit. And I'm thinking, if I lived in these conditions, to me, the vacation would be, let's go hit the Hilton for a weekend, you know, and get a hot shower and a nice bed for a day. But no, he didn't let him bother him. He was a model of contentment. He was a model of someone who understood, this is how I'm living, and he's just like us. It didn't let him get him down. And I think there's a model there, is what I'm trying to say. Well, we need to keep moving. Let's look at verse 10 and verse 11. Verses 10 and 11, Paul says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me hath flourished again, wherein ye were also careful, but ye lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned, in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I think the third point about contentment that we can draw from this passage, it's an important one for us that we often miss. And that is this: contentment can be matured in your life. Contentment is something that can be developed. It can be learned. It can be brought about over time as a result of your investment into understanding contentment in your life. In other words, contentment is not a dependency. You know, oftentimes we think of contentment as, well, it's a byproduct of me having something. It's a byproduct of a blessing that God's given in my life. It's a byproduct of whatever situation that I'm in. When my circumstances are all aligned properly and they're all working in my favor, then I'm content. And it's like, I think it was Rockefeller, the great oil and train tycoon from about 100 years ago. It was said to him, he was at one point one of the richest people in the world. And someone came to Rockefeller one time and says, Rockefeller, at what point are you going to have enough money? I mean, because you've got all this money. He says, when are you going to say I've had enough? And he says, well, when I've had $1 more. That's always his answer. $1 more. And that's how contentment works for us. We tend to think, oh, when this happens, I'll be content. And then it gets to that point and, oh, well, but I really needed this. And we get to that point and we say, then when I'll be content. And you get to that point, you say, you know what? I need just one more. Oh, I just need these things. Oh, but you know what? That didn't make me content either. We always need just one more. We think it's a byproduct of our circumstances or our situation or the blessings in our life. Paul says that's not true. He says contentment is a learned behavior. Contentment is a learned behavior. He says, I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. In other words, it's not based on the state you are in, the circumstances you face, or whether or not people treat you well. Paul rejoiced when they provided for him. That's what he says. He says, I'm rejoicing that you were able to give me a gift to the Philippians. He says, but you know what? He says, I understand. There was a time that you couldn't give me a gift, and I didn't get those things. He says, you also were careful. That's a King James way of saying, hey, you wanted to bring care to me, but you weren't able to do it. You didn't have the opportunity. He says, you know what? I'm rejoicing when you give me those things, and I'm understanding when you don't, because my contentment isn't based on whether or not you give me a gift, whether or not I have a need that's been met. Paul was content even though he went without things. He says, that's why not that I speak in respect to want. He says, it's not that I'm here asking you for more money. He says, because my contentment isn't based on whether or not you send me something to help me out. He says, my contentment is something that I have had to learn. It's not this feeling that comes upon me. It's something that I've had to work at. And he says, gradually, over time, he's matured in his ability to achieve that state of contentment that's independent of the things or the people around you. I think that's probably the single biggest obstacle to our psyche as American believers. To understand that contentment is something that we're going to have to work at. Contentment is something we're going to have to learn and mature. And as we grow in Christ and as we grow in our understanding of who God is and what He does for us, it's not going to be hey, every time I get a gumball from the Lord, that's when I'm going to be happy. We know all blessings come from the Lord, but that's not the basis of our contentment or our thanksgiving. We need to rethink our understanding of contentment. It's not something that God places on us. It's not something that's a byproduct of our circumstances. It is a learned state. We are to have contentment as a goal in our lives as we mature, that we grow towards. As we gain maturity, we are to become more and more content. This is what Paul was able to learn through his experience and his circumstances. And then, finally, we look at the last point, verses 12 and 13. He says, I know how to be abased. That means bottom of the barrel. He says, I know how to abound. That means living high on the hog. All paraphrases, right? He says, everywhere and in all things, I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. I always put my dander up when I get to that verse, Philippians 4:13, because there is a coffee mug that you can get now that I can do all things through a verse taken out of context. Think about that one for a minute. Oftentimes we just pull this verse out and say, look, I can do anything. Christ strengthens me. This is not the context of the verse. This verse is dealing with the contentment and inner peace by which you can deal with any circumstance that comes in your life. It's not about climbing Mount Everest. It's about having an inner contentment that is confounding to the world. That's something that comes despite what's going on around you, that you can have this inner peace and contentment in you. What does Paul say? I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Do you know that we are instructed to be content? It's not just boy, I hope someday I'm content. It's not someday I hope my circumstances will work out so that I'm content. It's not, oh boy, maybe someday I'll have something to be thankful for. No, Paul says we're instructed. This is an instruction. That's why contentment, and our last point is this, contentment matters. It matters to our lives as believers. We're instructed whether we're full or hungry, he says. He says whether we abound or we suffer need, no matter what situation we are in, we are always constructed to be content. There is never a reason, never a time, never an occasion where things get so bad when we say, I need to be discontent. Because do you know what you're saying when you are discontent in your circumstances? You're saying, God, I either don't believe that my circumstances were orchestrated by you, and therefore you're a God that's not really in control. Or you say, God, I believe you've orchestrated the circumstances around me, and I do not like them. In other words, you haven't given me circumstances that are good. You haven't given what's good to me. You know, sometimes God gives us bad circumstances, but God's still always good in them. That's something that we forget in the midst of our dark times. Even in the worst of situations, we can still be content because we can know that God's in control. Because we can know that God orchestrated whatever events we have going on in our life for His glory. That somehow we are supposed to learn or grow through it. Somehow we are supposed to impact others through it. Somehow we are supposed to grow and mature in our faith through it. Whatever it may be, God gives us even the worst of circumstances so that we can glorify Him in the end. And so therefore, we can always be content. We're instructed to be content because the contentment is not based on our ability to handle it. Verse 13 tells us our contentment is based on the fact that we've drawn on the strength of Christ in our life. Not because, I've got enough willpower to turn myself content. It's because I have been able to connect myself with the power and the strength of Christ in my life as a believer, that I've found contentment no matter what storms of life may be passing through. Because every time we demonstrate contentment in the worst of circumstances, we demonstrate the power of Christ in our life. He gives us the power to handle those circumstances and still have the peace and contentment that defies world's explanation around us. And do you know what that gives us? A stronger witness to everyone around us. Someone should come to you and say, how are you so happy in the midst of this problem you're dealing with? You just got, people in your life who, they've got sickness or disease, you've got financial hardships, you've got relationship problems, you've got this or that, and people around you know this, and you know what they see? They see joy and contentment and peace. Where does that come from? Well, let me tell you. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. Let me tell you how I get through the hard times. I draw on the power of Christ in my life. Do you know the Lord is your Savior? There's your window of opportunity to share the gospel because of contentment in your heart. See, the gospel doesn't always have to be about street evangelism like we got to do in Mexico or go into a foreign field. Sometimes you can get an opportunity to share the gospel just because you've exhibited the qualities of Christ-likeness in your own life and in your heart. And someone says, I want that. I need that. Tell me more about how you're different. And that gives us the opportunity to share Christ. Because you know what? Our contentment, again, this is a wrong way of thinking. Our contentment is not about you. Your contentment is not just about me having a feeling or a peace or something on the inside. Sometimes it's an instruction and it's a demonstration to others of Christ that is in you. And that's the great outworking of contentment. It demonstrates the power of Christ to people around you. When we understand contentment the way the Apostle Paul did, or the way some of our Mexican brothers and sisters do, or the way maybe some others that you know in your life that have joy and contentment and peace despite their circumstances, when we begin to have that and model it in our life, do you know what? We will truly have a heart of thanksgiving. We will be at a place when anytime, anywhere, someone says, hey, what do you have to thank the Lord for this week? Well, let me tell you. Things are going haywire everywhere in my life. And you know what? God's given me peace down deep inside. Things just all went kaput today. But you know what? I've still got joy in the Lord. I've still got God's truth in my heart. I've still got these things in my mind that aren't going to ever leave me. I've still got God's blessings and His faithfulness. I can still draw on the fact that He's a just God and He's going to set things right someday. I can still draw on the fact that even in the midst of my trial, God can use me to share Christ with others. These are things that we can thank the Lord for every day. And oftentimes contentment or discontentment is the greatest obstacle to thanksgiving in our lives.